Hello there, and welcome to the Stop Formula Grant Program recording on the Stop Violence Against Women Formula Grant Progress Reporting Form. This recording is intended for Stop Subgrantees. If you are a Stop administrator, there is a separate recording specifically for you available on our website, vawamei.org. Thank you for accessing our recording. We have a couple goals for this session, including increasing your understanding of the overall reporting process, letting you know who you should contact if you ever need assistance, introducing you to the resources available to you, and walking you through how to respond to questions on the STOP Annual Subgrantee Reporting Form. The STOP Subgrantee Reporting Cycle begins with you, the subgrantee, who fills out this annual progress reporting form. You then send it to your STOP administrator. Each STOP administrator sets the date that their state subgrantee reports are due to them. The administrator then will send all of the records from their state onto the team I work on, VAWA MEI. We carefully comb through all of those records, looking for any potential inconsistencies or missing sections of data. And if we find anything we have questions about or we think might need further clarification, we send it back to the STOP administrator. When we've finished our cleaning and analysis, we turn all of those reports into products that we share with OVW and send back to the STOP administrator. STOP data matters because it is your opportunity to communicate with OVW and share the work and success stories from your community. It helps OVW and other decision makers understand the scope of domestic and sexual violence, and it is a primary way that VAWA's effectiveness is measured and reported on. A couple of general tips for successful data reporting include reading the separate instructions. These are available on our website, as are a variety of additional reporting tools, helpful hints, frequently asked questions documents. Throughout the form, we recommend that you use the other category only as a last resort. If you can fit a response into an existing category, please use the existing category. Throughout the form, there are optional narrative information questions, and you can use these narrative questions to capture your successes, provide further clarification about the data you're submitting, or provide more details humanizing the quantitative data. And our last tip is that you validate your form when you have finished filling it out, and we'll talk about that and what that means at the end of this recording. This is our website where those resources I just mentioned live, vawamei.org. Now for the form itself. In the first section, A1, this is a required section. All subgrantees must complete this subsection every year that you're submitting data. Questions 1 through 5 are pretty self-explanatory. In question 1, you'll put in the date that you submit the report to your administrator. In question 2, you'll put the reporting period that the data captured in this report reflects. So if you were submitting your data in February of 2020, you'll be reporting on the 2019 reporting period. So you'd put 2019 in question 2. You put your name and your subgrants in 3 and 4. And question 5 is simply a check the best fit question about the type of organization receiving the STOP subgrant funding. 5A and 5B are also yes or no questions about whether it is that grant recipient organization is a faith-based organization, 5A, or in 5B, if they are a culturally specific community-based organization. And this comes with a very specific definition. To qualify as a culturally specific community-based organization, that organization must have a focus on some underserved population or populations. That organization must not merely be providing services to that underserved population, but providing culturally competent services designed to meet specific needs of that population. And finally, at a minimum, that culturally specific community-based organization must have some expertise or demonstrated capacity to work effectively on DV, SA, or stalking, or acquire that expertise through collaboration with another entity. So you can keep that definition in mind when you're wondering if you qualify in question 5B. In question 6, put the point of contact. This is who the administrator will be reaching back out to if they have any questions about the data reported on this progress reporting form. Question 7, indicate if the subgrant specifically addresses tribal populations, and if so, list exactly which tribes and nations are addressed using this subgrant. In question 8, indicate approximately what % of your STOP program subgrant was directed to each of these 3 different victimization categories. If you're having trouble figuring this out, we recommend you look at things like the topics of the training events that you put on in the following year, or the victimizations of the victims you served. This brings us to section A2, staff information. Check yes and fill out this section only if STOP program grant funds were used to pay staff, which includes part-time staff, contractors, overtime, part-time employees, any professional time being paid to conduct grant activities should count as a staff full-time equivalent, or FTE, in the staff section. So when you're filling out this question 9, only report staff funded under the STOP subgrant. Only report FTEs whose salary is provided, whether that's fully or partially, by STOP funding and the required match. Report by activity performed rather than by job title. So for example, if your program coordinator also conducts trainings, split out their time between those 2 staff categories. And finally, report to the second decimal. So as I mentioned, you're going to be reporting your staff time paid with grant funding or required match in FTEs, or full-time equivalents. So 1 FTE is equal to 1 person working full-time or 40 hours a week, the entire reporting period, which is 52 weeks in the year, which is a total of 2,080 working hours. So this slide that's currently up, you can use as a handy-dandy cheat sheet if you're ever having trouble calculating your FTEs. If you know that they work 20 hours a week, you can report them as 0.5 FTEs. If you have the total number of hours they worked over the entire reporting period, you can divide that by 2,080. We do have a couple examples. So if a county received a STOP subgrant that was used to fund 1 full-time prosecutor whose salary was 100% funded by the subgrant, and another full-time prosecutor whose salary was 25% supported by required match. In this case, you are only going to be reporting the STOP program funded and required match percentage of time. So the correct FTE under prosecutor would be 1.25 because you add those 2, that full-time and that 25% prosecutor together, because you only want to consider what is paid under the grant. In our next example, the subgrant also funded 300 hours of overtime for law enforcement officers. So to convert this time, you divide that 300 by the total 2,080, and you would report 0.14 under law enforcement officer. A couple common discrepancies we see are if a high number of FTEs are reported in a single category. If we see that, we will wonder if that FTE amount actually truly does reflect only the STOP funded time and required match, or if it might be the total across the entire organization. Another might be if staff are not prorated by job function. So if we see that you have many training events but no trainer FTEs, we might be wondering why that is, and if the other staff reported were correctly prorated by job function. And finally, if FTEs have not been prorated by hire date or receipt of funds. So if you cannot start using your STOP subgrant funding until, say, March in a given year, you want to make sure that you keep that in mind and only report FTEs based on the amount of time directly paid with STOP grant funding or required match. The next section, purpose areas, is also a required section. Check all purpose areas that apply to activities supported with STOP program funds during the current reporting period. Carefully review these purpose areas because they've been updated in 2019 to reflect the changes made by the VAWA reauthorization of 2013. Next section, C1, training. Check yes and fill this section out if STOP program funds were used to support training events and to train people during the current reporting period. Now, for the purposes of this form, the definition of training is providing information on sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, or stalking to professionals or volunteers acting in the role of a professional to improve their response to victim survivors as it relates to their role in the system. So any general information dissemination or anything geared towards increasing public awareness, that would actually not be training for the purposes of this form. That will be considered education and gets reported in the next section, C2. So you want to keep that distinction of is it training or is it education in mind when you're filling out your progress reporting form. And the key difference is really that training is only for professionals. In both the training and education section, you will be asked to indicate how many events were provided with STOP funding during the current reporting period. So to count one event, you count by each separate audience. So for example, one event might be a 3-day-long conference. If you were giving the conference to the same group of people, that might count as one event, or would count as one event. However, if you are giving a 30-minute lecture to one group of people in the morning, and then in the afternoon you're giving another half-hour lecture to a different group of people, that counts as 2 events. So events are counted the same way in question 11 in the training section, and I believe it's question 15 in the education section. And then in the training section, you are also going to be asked to report the people trained by their professional category. So it's helpful to keep track of that so that you can accurately report there. In the education section, you only have to check off the different types of groups that you educated with STOP program funds. In both, you will also then check off the topic areas covered in those training events or those education events. The next section, C3, is another mandatory section, coordinated community response. Check off all activities that apply for the current reporting period. So any agency you met with, have referrals with, consultations, provided technical assistance, that is where you indicate those connections in the CCR section. In section C4, policies and legislation updates. Check yes and fill this section out if STOP program funds were used to develop, substantially revise, or implement policies or protocols, or to promote or develop state, local, or tribal legislation and policies during the current reporting period. So in this whole section, you're just checking all that apply. But you want to think carefully about these, this question of were funds used to develop, substantially revise, or implement policies, protocols, or legislation? Because those verbs have 3 very specific definitions. So to develop means to create a new policy or protocol. To substantially revise means to make a significant amendment to an existing policy or protocol. So if you're simply adding in another underserved population to the group of underserved populations that you already serve, and you're not changing anything else about a policy or protocol, that probably would not count as a substantial revision. It has to be really, substantive. And finally, to implement or to carry out a new or revised policy or protocol as standard practice. So if you're checking this section off in 1 year for the development of a particular policy, and the next year to implement it, then in the 3rd year you would not fill it out again for further implementation, because implementation is a per policy sort of a one-time phenomenon. It's when you're carrying out a new or recently revised policy. And then in question 21, it's a narrative question. You can describe the development or promotion of state, local, or tribal legislation and policies. The next section, C5, fill this out only if STOP program funds were used to develop or substantially revise products during the current reporting period. and the same definitions of develop or substantially revise apply. So you will only be reporting the number that were developed or revised. If you filled out this form previously, you will notice there's no longer space to report the number used or distributed. So if stop funds were only being used to support the distribution or use of a product, you will no longer be reporting in the product section. D6, data collection and communication systems, check all that apply. If stop funds were used to develop, install, or expand data collection or communication systems during the current reporting period. Specialized units, C7, this is another check all that apply for the current reporting period, but a specialized unit has a specific definition. It is a centralized or coordinated group, unit, or dedicated staff of police officers, prosecutors, probation officers, or judges, or other court personnel responsible for handling sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, or stalking cases. Section C8, system improvement. Check yes and fill this section out if STOP program funds were used for system improvement during the current reporting period. Data recorded here should describe improvements made that influence a broad system-wide response. And again, you can check all that apply. The victimizations, the victim services versus law enforcement bodies that STOP program funds are being used to improve, as well as exactly how. This brings us to Section D, Victim Services and Legal Services. You're going to check yes and fill this section out only if STOP program funds were used to provide victim services. So if you're reporting in this section, you should have victim services staff reported in the staff section. If you are only supporting, say, a prosecutor and an investigator, and STOP funds are not being used to fund anyone else, just the prosecutor and investigator, you should not be reporting in the victim services section. The section should outline only work done by dedicated victim services staff. At the same time, this section should capture all work being done by STOP program funded victim services staff. So for example, if you have a victim assistant located at the prosecutor's office, you should still be reporting that victim assistance activities in the victim services section, not the prosecution section. So most of the data requested in this victim services section is congressionally mandated. Congress wants to know exactly how many of the victim survivors seeking services were served and how many could not be served. Keep in mind when you're filling out this section to only provide data that represents those victim survivors served and services provided with STOP program funding. Please do not report your entire agency's worth of victim services activities in Section D. I read that part. So to report a victim survivor in this section, they must meet 3 different criteria. They must have requested or accepted a service. That service must be STOP subgrant funded. And the victim survivor must be a primary victim of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. The first question in the victim services section is question 29, where you will be reporting all victims served, partially served, and not served. There are 3 distinct definitions of these for this form. So a person is counted as served if they received all of the requested STOP-funded services. They are considered partially served if they were only able to receive some, but not all, of the STOP-funded services that they requested. And they're considered not served if they did not receive any of the services that are provided by STOP funds that they were requesting from you. We do have some examples. So a victim whose ex-husband has been charged with stalking comes into the prosecutor's office to get information about the criminal process. The STOP-funded victim witness assistant explains the process to her. She asks the assistant to attend the arraignment with her, but the victim witness assistant is always scheduled to be in another court on that date. This victim received information from the STOP-funded assistant, but not the other service she requested, which is normally provided under the STOP program subgrant. How should this victim be reported? As served, partially served, or not served? The correct answer is partially served, because this victim sought grant-funded services, and the program could provide some, but not all, of those services with STOP subgrant funding during the current reporting period. In our next example, a woman who was sexually assaulted by her live-in boyfriend has the police respond. The police officer who responds calls the STOP funded hotline on behalf of the victim, asking if an advocate will accompany the victim to the hospital during her examination. There is no advocate available to do this, and it is a service that is funded under the STOP program subgrant. How should this victim be reported? Served, partially served, or not served? In this case, the victim survivor is reported as C, not served, because she sought a grant-funded service, but the program could not provide the service that was requested. The next question on the form is question 30, number of new victim survivors served and partially served during the current reporting period. So for each victim survivor reported in 29A and 29B, consider the number of victims who began receiving STOP program-funded services during the current reporting period. If this is your first time using STOP program funds to provide victim services, all victims reported in 29A and 29B should be reported as new here in question 30. If a victim survivor has been counted as served or partially served in a previous reporting period, do not include them here, even if the victim survivor sought services for a new victimization. In question 31, for each victim reported in question 29A or 29B, report any additional types of victimizations for which they received STOP program-funded services during the current reporting period. Report a victim only once under each additional victimization, but report all that apply. So in our example from earlier, the woman who was sexually assaulted in a domestic violence incident, you would report that person as one under sexual assault column on the presenting victims of sexual assault row, and on that same row, presenting victims of sexual assault under the domestic violence/dating violence column. In question 32, secondary victim served, report all secondary victims who received STOP program-funded services during the current reporting period, such as children, siblings, spouses, relatives, anyone indirectly affected by these crimes. In question 33, indicate whether each reason applies to victim survivors partially served, not served, or both. So if you have any victims reported as partially served or not served, you will need to be checking off why in question 33. There is now separate columns for whether that reason applies to the people reported as not served or to the people reported as partially served. There is an other box in this question 33. However, there are, in many cases, when we see a response in the other box, it often indicates or reflects a misunderstanding of how to report victims, such as victim did not return, victim refused services. In both of those cases, in the case of victim did not return, if you began providing services to a victim and then they suddenly stopped showing up for their counseling session, you would actually report that person as served, not as partially served or not served. Because it's not that you as the organization were not able to provide that service, it's that they stopped attending it. If a victim refused services that were offered, you should not be reporting them at all in the victim services section. If services are not provided by your program, again, if they're only requesting services not provided by your STOP funded program, you would not be reporting them at all in this section. If you could not locate a victim, that also reflects a situation where if you were providing them services and then suddenly you could not locate them, then you would report them as served. If you never even began providing services before you could not locate them, you would not report them in this section. In question 34, demographics of victim survivors. You will need to report demographic information for each person served in the categories of race, ethnicity, gender, and age. The total race ethnicity category cannot be less than the sum of 29A and 29B, but there is an unknown category. New in 2019 is the additional category of some other race, ethnicity, or origin. You can report a person in multiple race categories. So the race total can be higher than the total of 29A and 29B. In the gender and age categories, the total must equal the total number of victims reported as served and partially served. There is an unknown category for each, but you can only report a person once in each category. New in 2019 is the additional category under gender of transgender or gender nonconforming. And in 2019, the age category of 13 to 17 has been updated to be 11 to 17 to reflect that broader age range that you can now serve as of the 2013 reauthorization of VAWA. The last part of this demographics question is other demographics. Now, none of these questions should ever be directly asked in order to receive services. For example, they should not be listed on intake forms. You can report people in this question simply as you learn of these other demographic statuses incidentally in the course of providing services. Question 35, victim-survivor relationship to offender by victimization. Again, the total underage crime category must equal the total victims reported as served and partially served for that crime category, but there is a relationship unknown category if you do not know the relationship of a victim to their offender. And here is also another place where you can report the same victim in multiple categories. So you could report the woman who was sexually assaulted in a DV incident here under current or former spouse or intimate partner under one under sexual assault and one under DV. In question 36A, report the number of primary victims from 29A and 29B who received STOP program-funded services. So anything you're reporting in 36A should only reflect those services provided with STOP funding or required match. Count each victim only once for each type of service they received during the current reporting period under the column number of victims survivors served. Then, under the next column, number of times service was provided, report the total number of times all victim survivors received the STOP funded service. So, for example, if 10 victims each received counseling 3 times during the current reporting period, the number reported under time service provided would be 30, because it's the total across all victims served. There should be at least as many victims accounted for, in this question, 36A, you should be reporting at least one service for each victim you reported as served in 29A and 29B. So if you reported 30 people served in question 29, there should be at least 30 different victims reported across the various type of service categories in that column of number of victim survivors served. An update as of 2019 is that there's no longer a civil legal assistance category because that data will now be reported under the legal services section, which is a whole section unto itself. The remaining questions in the victim services section, shelter services, hotline support, witness notification, and protection orders, should only be reported in for STOP program funded activities. So for example, if your shelter supports if STOP funding supports 10% of your shelter, only 10% of the victim survivors served and total bed nights should be reported in 36B shelter services, not the total for your organization. If the STOP subgrant funds do not support the shelter at all, then nothing should be reported in 36B. And the same goes for hotline calls and victim witness outreach. Also in question 37, only report the protection orders which STOP program-funded victim services staff provided assistance to victim survivors in obtaining. If an attorney or a paralegal assisted victims in obtaining protection orders, do not report them here in 37. They will be reported in legal services as a legal issue. Which brings us to the legal services section. So the definition of legal services on this progress report is that it is only provided by STOP-funded attorneys or paralegals. So if your STOP subgrant did not fund attorneys or paralegals, do not fill out the legal services section. In question 38, report the number of primary victims that were reported in 29 who had legal issues addressed during the current reporting period. You will be reporting each victim only once under each type of legal issue. For B, family law matters, and G, immigration matters, on that top line, B and G, Provide an unduplicated count of victims who received assistance in one or more of the subcategories listed under each of those general categories. So you can report a victim under each type of legal issue that you provided STOP program-funded assistance, but only report them once under each. So for example, if you helped one victim with a divorce and also a custody visitation arrangement, under B, you would report 1 under family law matters, 1 under divorce, and 1 under custody and visitation. In 39, report the number of victim survivors who received assistance with legal issues in question 38. So this should be a total unduplicated count of all victims receiving assistance with legal issues. In question 40, report an unduplicated count of the total victims who received assistance with multiple legal issues. So question 40 should never be greater than question 39. In question 41, legal outcomes. Report an outcome for all cases closed or issues resolved during the current reporting period for which services were provided by STOP program-funded attorneys or paralegals. If you're reporting an outcome in the information referral advice only column, you should not be reporting any other outcome for that particular case. There's also an optional additional information question where you can describe the effectiveness of victim services and legal services. The next section, E1, law enforcement. Check yes and fill this section out only if STOP program funds or the required match directly support a law enforcement officer or a prosecution-based investigator. Provide information only for the STOP funded activities. Do not report your entire law enforcement agency's activities in this section. If an advocate is located at the law enforcement agency, but STOP funds are not supporting law enforcement officer FTEs, report victim services activities in section D and do not report law enforcement activities. In question 43, if the STOP, so fill out all the activities that the STOP program funded staff engaged in on STOP funded time during the current reporting period. If the subgrant supports a prosecution-based investigator, report the cases investigated by that person in question 43 and any arrests or referrals to the prosecutor that occurred as a result of those STOP-funded investigations. So if you are not funding a prosecutor and only funding a prosecution-based investigator, only report in law enforcement and do not report in the prosecution section. In question 44, report victim survivor referrals, and in question 45, report protection orders, only the protection orders that STOP-funded law enforcement staff provided assistance to victims in obtaining. In the next section, E2 prosecution, check yes and fill this out if STOP funds directly supported a prosecutor. If a victim assistant is employed by or located at the prosecutor's office, report their activities in victim services and not prosecution. Cases should be categorized by the most serious offense and may include numerous charges or counts. In question 47A, number of cases received, accepted, and declined, as well as referred for federal prosecution. We expect to see the number of cases received and then line A to be about equal to the sum of B, C, D, and E. They don't have to be exactly equal because, of course, some cases might be received in one year and not a decision might not be made around accepting or declining or transferring until the following year, and that's fine. But we expect them to be within a reasonable degree of one another. In question 47B, report one reason for each case declined. Report only the primary reason. So the total number of cases declined reported in 47 line C should be equal to the total number of reasons reported in 47B. In question 48, report the dispositions of all cases resolved during the current reporting period. You can refer to the separate instructions if you need a definition on dismissed, deferred adjudication, convicted, and acquitted. But in this question, it's very important to remember to report each case only by the most serious offense. So for example, if a Class A felony rape case was tried and the defendant was found guilty of rape, you would report that case as sexual assault felony guilty as charged. If a Class B felony domestic violence assault resulted in a plea to a misdemeanor assault, you would report that as DV felony pled to lesser in lower category. If you find yourself going to use the other box, please consider if that case that you're going to report as disposed of there actually fits into an existing category. Oftentimes we might see breaking and entering entered in the other box, but really when we reach out to find more information about that case, it was part of a domestic violence case that perhaps was pled down to just the breaking and entering charges. So you would report it in that instance, felony domestic violence line rather than the other line. The next section, I'll say one word about protection orders. In the prosecution section, report protection orders in question 52 only if STOP program funded prosecutors assisted victims in obtaining those protection orders. In section E3, courts provide information for STOP program funded court activities only. So check yes if your STOP subgrant funded court personnel in some way or funded a docket. If an advocate is located at the court, report their activities in the victim services section. In question 54, disposition of criminal cases, only complete this question if funds supported criminal cases and report the dispositions evolved from the cases that were resolved during the current reporting period. So and this goes for the prosecution dispositions question too, I just forgot to mention it. If a case has not yet been disposed of, do not report a disposition for it and do not report that it's dismissed. Just wait until it is disposed of to report that disposition. In question 55, report the number of offenders reviewed and individual hearings conducted. So the individual hearings conducted should be a total across the total offenders reviewed. So if you had, say, 3 offenders reviewed and they were each, they received 10 hearings each, you would report 30 in the number of individual review hearings conducted. In 56, report the disposition of violations during the current reporting period. Again, if there was not a disposition by the end of the period, do not report a disposition in 56. In section E4, probation and parole, in number 61, report the number of offenders monitored. Also report the number who completed probation with violations and without violations. So neither of those two categories nor the sum of them should be greater than the total number of offenders reported as monitored. In question 62, monitoring activities, report all activities that occurred during the reporting period under using STOP grant funding, including outreach to victims. And again, total contacts should be a total across all offenders monitored. New in 2019, you can report electronic monitoring. In question 63, disposition of violations, report the total number of cases in which there were dispositions of violations during the current reporting period. A violation does not have to have occurred during this reporting period, only disposition has to have occurred during the reporting period. A case might be counted more than once if there were multiple violations. The next section, E5, Better Intervention Program. Check yes and fill this out if that program funds were used for BIP during the current reporting period. Report the total number of offenders in your BIP program in question 66, and report the number of offenders who achieved a particular outcome in question 67. So only report those who completed or were terminated from the grant-funded BIP program. If a person is still in the program, do not report them in question 67. The last section on the form is the narrative section. All subgrantees must answer questions 69 and 70. 69 asks you to describe the most significant areas of remaining need in your community, and question 70 offers you the opportunity to provide more information about what STOP program funding has allowed you to do. If you are using funds to develop or implement the Crystal Judson Domestic Violence Protocol, then you must also answer question 71. 72 and 73 are optional, but 73 we encourage you to think of as your personal note to us at VAWA MAI. If you have any additional information you would like us to know about the data submitted, such as some information that would help explain, maybe something unusual in your data, write to us about it in question 73, because that's the first place we go when we go to interpret a report. Finally, at the very end of the form is the button to validate. So I mentioned at the beginning, this is a really good, helpful tip. If you're going to submit your form, make sure you validate it first. So when you press this validation button, you can get one of 3 different types of pop-up windows. The first type is this red X. This is a warning, and it's indicating that something on the form is incorrect. Either it's a missing question that is required, or 2 numbers that need to match don't line up, but whatever it is, you must resolve this before the form can be successfully validated. So when you see this, if you click yes, it will take you specifically to that section, that question, and you can look at it, figure out what it should be, and correct the information. The next type of warning you might get is technically a reminder, and it's a yellow triangle with an exclamation point in it. This flags things that seem odd, but are not necessarily incorrect. So one thing it flags is really high FTEs. So we encourage you to take these reminders seriously, look into them, make sure they're what you intended to report and not the result of a typo or something. And then finally, validation success. So once you have achieved this window, click OK, save your form with a new name, and then you're ready to submit your form to your staff administrator. If you ever have any questions, you should reach out to your staff administrator. They can help you verify grant-supported activities, let you know when your report is due, and answer any questions you might have about how to report data on the staff annual progress reporting form. If you have any more technical questions, did not mean to go forward yet. If you are looking to get any of those resources I mentioned at the beginning, such as the helpful hints, or the reporting instructions, or the frequently asked questions document, you can find all of those at vawamei.org. You can also find reports to Congress that include summaries of this STOP data as well as the other types of VAWA-funded data. Thank you very much for accessing our recording today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.